Hello, AP environmental scientists. Sorry I'm not able to be with you today. However, I do want to just give a real quick overview of what you have been working on Monday, and then what I'm going to have you guys work on today. It's sections 2.3 or topics 2.3 and 2.4. And so 2.3 is island biogeography. When you're talking about island biogeography, and hopefully you guys picked up on this, mainly what I wanted you to take away from it is, first of all, what is island biogeography? What is the theory of that? And it really has to do with the idea, it ties into biodiversity, it ties into succession, especially primary succession, because after an island is formed, it soon will become inhabited by organisms, and that's a very long process. But there's some things that play a role in how long that process actually is, and two of those things are primarily the size of the island. So the larger the island, the more room, the more space, the more likely it is to be able to support a larger number of species. And then also the distance that island is from the mainland. And so wherever these organisms may be coming from, that once they reach the island and start inhabiting it, the further away an island is from mainland, the less likely it is to become inhabited by certain species. And that plays a really big role in what organisms actually occupy that island. This graph right here is really important, and just to help you guys kind of understand, if you start off, we're looking at the rate of immigration, so the movement of organisms into an area, and then the rate of extinction, which when you're talking about primary succession, we don't often think about, well, could extinction be happening early on in the early stages of primary succession? But the reality is it can. And it all has to do with the organisms that reach the island. Are they going to be fit? Are they going to have the characteristics that are going to allow them to gain the resources they need and survive? And so as you look at island biogeography, we like to put immigration and extinction together. And as you see over on this side, so starting off with number of species present, when there's few species present, you're going to have more species able to move in just simply because there's space. And you're also going to have very, very little extinction. But as more species start to populate an area, you're going to find that immigration's going to move down because you're going to have things like competition, resource availability will change. And so the more competition there is, the less likely it is you're going to have more and more immigration. But the more competition there is, and as resources become less available because of the abundance in population, you're actually going to see an increase in extinction. And I think that's an easy concept, but when you put it in a graph, I just wanted to make sure that was clear. As extinction increases and immigration then decreases, the point here where they intersect, that is the point of equilibrium. And so an island that is closer to the mainland is going to have higher rates of immigration. However, those islands then, as immigration will decrease probably more quickly because they're going to fill up. There's not going to be any more room, and so therefore the extinction rates will increase at a faster rate. And so really the idea is just keeping in mind the size of the island, because size is going to play into availability of resources as succession happens, and then also the distance it is from the mainland. Another concept that I hope you picked up was this idea of invasives. Invasives are organisms that are moving into an area that did not originate there, and this is kind of one of those things where it's hard to think about if you go way back to the beginning of the formation of an island. It typically is cooled lava. You need to have organisms like lichen move in. They can start breaking down the rock. Seeds might get dropped in. Some plants are going. Obviously, our producers are the first thing that's going to have to inhabit the island, and then it's going to allow for food resources for our heterotrophic organisms or our consumers to move in. But as that's happening, more and more organisms will be moving in. And those organisms that are endemic means these are the organisms that originally were able to be successful on the island. You're going to tend to find that they are going to be a little bit more along the specialist, meaning that they have a very narrow niche. They need very specific resources. If those resources are not available, they're not going to thrive. There's going to be a higher level of competition much earlier on with the specialist in comparison to a generalist. A generalist is an organism that is really able to get resources pretty much any way. They, and I shouldn't say anyway, but they have a lot wider range, can occupy a much broader niche because they're going to be resourceful. They're going to be able to find resources that allow them to survive. Unfortunately, many of the invasive species that are coming in, what we find is that they're a little bit more of the generalist. And so when you have a specialist occupying a niche and a generalist invasive species move in, what happens is that invasive species, they're typically much better competitors. And if they're better competitors, they're going to win. Winning in this case means they're going to become more populated, and they literally can push out the endemic species, pushing them to extinction. So when you travel to islands, it's very, very important that you don't take extra seeds in, that you're not carrying insects. I know when I've traveled to the Galapagos Islands, they're very highly protected. They actually, before you get off the plane, they spray the plane down. They open all of our luggage. They spray it down before you even enter, and you go through security, and you can't take anything onto the islands. Likewise, they don't want you taking anything off either, but really more importantly, you don't want to carry an invasive organism species. You're eating a fruit, it has seeds, you throw those seeds away, that could end up becoming an invasive species. And so they don't allow that to happen in those islands. And then ultimately this idea, and we haven't talked about evolution, I hope you can remember it a little bit from biology, but the effect on evolution. Darwin's finches are a perfect example here on the Galapagos Islands. And the idea here, you guys, is really that the greater the variation in genetics of the organisms that land on the island. So let's say these finches, they blew over in a hurricane, they ended up on an island, there were plant species there, they were able to survive. Well, if those few species that reached the island had a wide range of traits, a wide variety of their own traits, even though they're the same species, they might find a way, they might have resources there that allow them to be successful. For example, let's say there's larger seeds, and the birds that blew over have some small beaks all the way up to some large beaks. Well, the larger beak birds are going to be more successful on that island. And what's going to happen over time is that those birds will begin to have larger and larger beaks. And if you can fast forward through enough time, then the birds, even though they originated from the mainland species and they were once one species, they actually will go through the process of speciation. Nature's going to select a trait that says, hey, if you have this trait, you're really successful here and you're going to do well. You're going to reproduce with individuals like you because they're also doing well, and you're going to have more offspring. The organisms that don't have that trait, or maybe they're not as fit, meaning they're not as good at competing against their other individuals in the intra-species, then they're not going to, and they're going to die out, and their traits will not be passed on. And what you see is this idea of speciation over time. And so it's kind of just looking at how islands and their biogeography play a role in speciation, and how those islands become inhabited. This next topic that you guys are going to look at today is ecological tolerance. Ecological tolerance, if you're tolerant to something, for example, I'm not very tolerant to the cold temperature. I have a really hard time maintaining body temperature. And so my tolerance might be a more narrow range than your tolerance. That's a genetic thing. That's something that's not like I like it or dislike it. That is, I actually will go hypothermic in a temperature where maybe another person wouldn't go hypothermic because my body doesn't do as good a job maintaining, regulating temperature. And so when we talk about tolerance, you guys, it's super important to understand that all living organisms have a tolerance. They can only survive, their cells can only survive if they are in a specific ecological environmental factor, if it's within a specific range. And so when we talk about organisms that are tolerant, it means that they have traits that allow them to be successful at sustaining their life in a specific ecological range. And so if you look at this chart here, so we have environmental factors. So you could put anything down here on that x-axis. You could have temperature, body temperature. You could have how salinated the ocean is. So as the climate's increasing in temperature, the ice caps, which are fresh water, are melting. They're desalinating oceans. That is causing a huge problem on a lot of our organisms that live in the ocean, because the amount of salt there, which they need because their cells know how to regulate life within a certain range. The optimal range is in the center. As we start to push those organisms, as ecological systems change, as we have disruptions, we're going to start putting these organisms into a state of stress. When we put the organisms into a state of stress, very few, and only the ones that actually are adapted, that can sustain. So for example, if it was temperature and we went into a colder temperature, I would be one of the first to die out. Okay? Organisms are like that. Some individuals within a species are going to be more adapted, have a broader range. However, it's still within a range of tolerance. Once we go completely outside of that tolerance, we say that's intolerant, and that is where that species, it becomes critical. And if all of the individuals within a species are intolerant to a certain environmental factor, that is when that species goes extinct. And so focusing on the topic of ecological tolerance, it just helps us kind of set up as we start to look at the next units are going to be actual disruptions that would push us outside of ecological tolerance, as well as adaptations, those characteristics, those genetic traits that individuals have that would allow them to maybe survive on these fringes, maybe survive as they're undergoing stress, while some of the counterparts are not. For example, if you think about, this is really kind of natural selection in a way. If you think about giraffes, as the giraffes evolved from short necks to long necks, if there were no giraffes with long necks to start with, that variation wasn't there. The giraffes would have gone extinct because there was a time where their food source was higher in a tree. Only the giraffes that could reach that food source got food. Therefore, they were the only ones sustaining their lives. The short-necked giraffes died. They were no longer able to reproduce, and so therefore their genetic traits were not passed on. And so we'll look at those adaptations. Adaptations are simply genetic traits that'll give an individual an advantage of being successful in a given environment, especially when the environmental factor may be creating stress on that organism. And then we'll take a look at ecological succession, and you guys will finish up before you go on Thanksgiving break with an ecological succession, just doing it interactive, looking at primary and secondary succession. So sorry again, I couldn't be with you today. I hope this helps out a little bit. Go ahead and make sure you get your notes. I wish you all well. I'm thinking of you all. And if you need anything at all, please reach out to me on the Remind 101 or send me a direct email. Thanks, you guys. Take care and know that I care about you and am here for you. Bye-bye.